Welcome! In this video, we'll try to make sense of what the EU is and what the EU is not by giving an overview of the different conceptualizations that have been attributed to it. Indeed, the EU is a complex entity since it possesses characteristics of, but also does not fit into the traditional dichotomy of domestic versus international governance. This makes studying the European Union a very fascinating task. First, in the beginning, some have asked the question if the EU can be equated to a nation-state. Most people now agree that the EU does not fit into the category of a state in a traditional sense. While the member states of the European Union are of course all nation-states, the EU is clearly more than its building blocks. However, the EU does have some essential state-like characteristics. Like nation-states, the EU has its own flag, anthem, and has the euro as its currency. Some of the EU institutions also perform similar functions as nation-states. For instance, there is the European Commission, which has a role similar to the governance of a state. There is also the European Parliament, which represents the European citizens and is also directly elected by them. Then, there is the Council of the European Union. In this institution, the member states are represented, and you might want to compare it to a Senate or to an upper house in another political system. Together, they adopt legislation in a decision-making process that has many similarities to how decisions are being made in nation-states. At the same time, the EU lacks a range of characteristics that states usually have. Notably, the member states still have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. There is no European police force and there's no European army, and the EU is mainly dependent on member states' resources when it comes to its common foreign and security policy. Secondly, in major areas at the national level, such as healthcare and education, the EU can only support the member states in its competences. In other areas, the EU lacks real competences. For example, regarding taxation, the EU lacks real tax and spending capacity. In other words, it has no fiscal powers. Lastly, some authors have argued if the absence of a strong European identity prevents the EU from being a state. Stepping away from the idea of a unitary state, scholars have wondered whether the EU could be better depicted as a federal state, like Belgium, Germany, Canada, or the United States, or, alternatively, as a confederation. What is the difference between both? The main difference is the level of sovereignty that states, provinces, or regions submit to a central government. In a federation, these entities establish a common central government, to which they submit part of their authority. They allow the central level to implement or to supervise certain actions, and they accept a subordinated position. On the other hand, in a confederation, the states that are part of it retain far more authority. They only agree to a certain limitation of their freedom, and they regard the central government as a joint machinery. If the EU is one of the two, one could say that the EU has more characteristics of a federation than of a confederation. Indeed, while the founders of the EU didn't necessarily envisage creating federal structures, the institutional setup contains some federal elements. For example, it is the member states and not the central level that holds the exclusive power to amend the treaties of the EU. Secondly, one could also perceive the European Commission as a federal institution, independent of the member states, because it has in principle the monopoly on legislative initiative in the EU. Furthermore, given that the EU guarantees a territorial division of powers under the treaties, and that the member states have agreed to limit their lawmaking powers, many scholars argue that the EU certainly goes further than a confederation. From this point of view, the EU indeed rather resembles a federation, since it is typical for federal states to divide sovereign powers over multiple levels of governance. However, most of the arguments on why the EU cannot be perceived as a unitary state also apply to a federation. That means that the EU also does not fit perfectly the category of a federation or a confederation. Yet another option to explore is whether the EU is an international organization. In general, we could state that there are two types of international organizations: intergovernmental ones and supranational ones. In intergovernmental organizations, the member states voluntarily promote cooperation and coordination. However, They remain independent and they do not surrender any substantial sovereignty to the organization. In supranational organizations, the member states agree to transfer powers to the organization in some areas, and they will accept that they have to adhere to decisions taken by the organization. Sometimes, the members even establish a court and enforcement mechanisms to determine and act when violations of decisions taken by the supranational actor occur. The way the member states handed over decision-making powers to the EU institutions in the beginning resembled more the functioning of a supranational organization. Whereas the EU began as an organization for economic integration, the member states soon handed over competences to the supranational level in other domains as well. It has now developed into an organization with comprehensive policymaking powers in many different policy areas, from social, immigration and justice, to climate, environment, and external relations. However, in certain policy areas, like the common foreign security policy, the EU certainly still functions as an intergovernmental organization when making decisions. There is some level of coordination at the EU level, but in general, the member states hold the power to make decisions. In the next modules, you will learn that the EU has both intergovernmental and supranational characteristics. It is also far more integrated than any other international organization, like for example, the United Nations, the African Union, or ASEAN. However, there's also a strong case against classifying the EU as an international organization, namely, that it has too many state-like or federalist characteristics.